Have you ever walked into a place that belonged to you, only to feel like you were the one who didn't belong anymore? Have you ever trusted your family so completely that you never imagined they'd make decisions about your property without even asking you? And what would you do if you unlocked your own front door and discovered strangers celebrating inside as though they had been waiting for you to leave? My husband and I bought our second home almost 30 years ago. It wasn't a mansion or a vacation house. It was simply a quiet little place we'd worked hard to afford after years of saving every extra dollar we could. We always dreamed that one day it would help make our retirement easier. After my husband passed away, I couldn't bring myself to sell it. Every room reminded me of the life we'd built together. Instead, I kept it clean, paid the taxes, and visited every few weeks. Eventually, I decided it was finally time to rent it out. The extra income would help, and I liked the idea of the house being lived in instead of sitting empty. My son knew about my plans. My daughter-in-law knew too. In fact, only a few days earlier, she had smiled and said, "That's a good idea, Mom. Empty houses should never stay empty." At the time, I thought she was simply being supportive. Looking back, I wonder if those words meant something completely different. On the morning I planned to meet a couple interested in renting the house, I packed the paperwork, grabbed my keys, and drove over, feeling surprisingly hopeful. It felt like any other visit, the kind I'd made dozens of times before. The sun was shining, the neighborhood was quiet, and I found myself thinking about how relieved my husband would have been, knowing the house would finally be earning something instead of costing something. But the moment I pulled into the driveway, something didn't feel right. There were far too many cars parked outside. At first, I assumed maybe one of the neighbors was having visitors. Then I noticed one of the cars belonged to my daughter-in-law's parents. My stomach tightened just a little. They had never once mentioned coming here. As I stepped out of my car, I heard music, then laughter, loud laughter. It wasn't coming from next door, it was coming from inside my house. For a moment, I couldn't make myself move. I kept telling myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe my son had stopped by to check on the place. Maybe someone had borrowed the house for a few hours and simply forgotten to tell me. I kept walking toward the front door, but with every step, the voices became louder. Someone cheered. Glasses clinked together. I even smelled food cooking before I reached the porch. My hands suddenly felt cold as I unlocked the front door with my own key. The moment I pushed it open, every conversation inside stopped. 5 people turned and looked at me. Sitting comfortably in my living room were my daughter-in-law's parents and 3 of their relatives. Drinks covered my coffee table. My husband's favorite chair had been pushed into the corner to make room for extra seating. One woman was carrying plates into my kitchen as though she'd done it 100 times before. I couldn't even process what I was seeing. Finally, I managed to ask, "Can someone please tell me what's going on?" My daughter-in-law's father leaned back on my sofa, smiled without the slightest bit of embarrassment, and laughed. "Relax," he said. "Our daughter allowed it." Then he looked around the room as though he already belonged there before adding the words that made my heart sink. "This house will be hers anyway." In that moment, I wasn't wondering why they were having a party. I wasn't even thinking about the strangers sitting in my living room. I was thinking about one terrifying question. How long had my own family been making plans for my house without me ever knowing? For several long seconds, no one said a word. The music had stopped, but somehow the silence felt even louder. My daughter-in-law's father looked around the room before quietly saying, "We didn't think you'd mind. Our daughter said the house was sitting empty." I stared at him, wondering if I'd heard him correctly. Sitting empty? That house wasn't abandoned. I'd been there less than 2 weeks earlier. I'd cleaned every room myself, checked every window, and made sure everything was ready for prospective tenants. Empty didn't mean available. Before I could answer, my daughter-in-law's mother spoke gently. "We just thought it would be easier to have everyone here instead of crowding into our house. We honestly didn't think it would upset you." My eyes slowly moved around the room again. Someone had set a bowl of chips on the coffee table my husband had built with his own hands. A child's jacket was hanging over the back of his favorite chair. Someone had placed a drink on the small table where my husband always kept our wedding photograph. We'd celebrated nearly 30 anniversaries in that dining room. It no longer felt like my home. None of this had happened by accident. None of it had been decided an hour earlier. It had taken planning. That realization hurt even more than finding strangers inside my home, because strangers hadn't planned this. My own family had. I waited for someone to tell me there had been a misunderstanding. Instead, my daughter-in-law's father quietly added, "Our daughter said this house would probably be hers one day anyway." Probably, not today, but close enough that everyone else had already started acting as though my opinion no longer mattered. Just then, another car pulled into the driveway. A few seconds later, my son and daughter-in-law walked through the open front door, carrying 2 grocery bags. My son's face drained of color as he looked from me to the crowded living room. The grocery bags slipped slightly in his hands before he caught them. "Mom," he whispered, "I wasn't expecting you this early." He wasn't surprised to see everyone in my house. He was only surprised to see me. My daughter-in-law quietly said, "Mom, we were going to tell you after today." I looked at my son. I kept waiting for him to say, "They were wrong," to remind everyone that the house still belonged to me. He opened his mouth as though he wanted to explain, then looked around at everyone else instead. Finally, he looked away. "Mom, please," he said quietly, "let's not do this in front of everyone. They're only here for today." That was the moment I stopped believing this was a misunderstanding. If this had truly been a misunderstanding, my son would have been asking the same questions I was. Instead, he was answering them, which meant he had known. Maybe not every detail, but enough. I took one slow breath and looked back at the people sitting comfortably on my furniture. "Everyone," I said calmly, "I'd appreciate it if you left." The room immediately became uncomfortable. My daughter-in-law's mother lowered her eyes. Before anyone else could speak, my daughter-in-law quietly said, "Mom, it's not like strangers were using it." I looked past her, at the photographs still hanging on the wall, at the hallway where my husband used to leave his work boots after every long day. Then I looked back at her. "No," I said quietly, "it's my house." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply turned around, walked back to my car, and drove away. In my rearview mirror, I could see my son hurrying outside, waiting for me to stop. I didn't. Then one thought settled into my mind so heavily that it stayed with me the entire drive home. If they had a key today, how many times had they used it before without me ever knowing? I drove home in complete silence. The radio stayed off. My phone rang twice before I even reached my driveway. I already knew who it was without looking. I let it ring until the screen went dark. A minute later, it started again. Then came the text messages. "Mom, please answer. We can explain." I didn't reply. Every vibration made me wonder whether they were sorry for what they'd done or simply sorry that I'd seen it. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew explanations weren't what I needed anymore. I wanted answers to questions no one had even realized I was asking. The first thing I did after walking into my own house was unlock the small fireproof box where I kept every important document: the deed, insurance papers, tax records, spare keys. Everything was exactly where I'd left it, except one spare key was missing. I sat there staring at the empty space for several long seconds. At first, I tried convincing myself I'd simply misplaced it. Then I remembered something that made my stomach sink. Years earlier, after my husband passed away, I'd handed my son a spare key. Just in case, I'd told him. Just in case I ever needed help. Just in case something happened to me. Somewhere along the way, that spare key had stopped being a backup and quietly become an invitation. I picked up my phone and called my son. He answered almost immediately. "Mom, I've been trying to reach you. I didn't waste time. Do you still have the spare key I gave you?" The silence on the other end lasted only a second, but it was a second too long. "Yes," he finally admitted. "Did you give a copy to your wife?" Another pause. "Mom, please answer the question." His voice dropped. "Yes." I closed my eyes. "And did she give one to her parents?" This time, the silence lasted even longer. When he finally spoke, his answer barely sounded like his own voice. I think she did. Think. He didn't know for certain. Or maybe he didn't want to know. Either answer frightened me. "How many people have keys to my house?" I asked quietly. "Mom?" "I don't know." He didn't know. Somehow, that frightened me even more. After we hung up, I called a locksmith. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. 2 hours later, I stood on the front porch as he removed the old lock. It dropped into his toolbox with a dull metal clink that echoed far louder than it should have. A few minutes later, he tested the new lock and handed me a fresh set of keys. Smiling politely, he said, "Now only the people you choose can get in." I thanked him, but his words stayed with me long after he drove away. My husband had spent 30 years filling that house with our life together. Protecting it wasn't just about bricks and wood anymore. I owed it to both of us to make sure no one else decided what happened to it. That evening, my son pulled into the driveway. I watched him through the front window. He walked up to the porch without looking up. Out of habit, he reached into his pocket and slid the old key into the lock. It didn't turn. He tried again, then again. Finally, he stopped, for the first time in years. The key in his pocket no longer opened my door. A second later, he slowly raised his hand and knocked. I opened the door slowly. My son stood on the porch exactly where he'd stood hundreds of times before. The only difference was that this time he couldn't let himself in. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. He looked exhausted. His eyes were red, and his shoulders seemed to carry far more than the weight of the conversation waiting between us. Finally, he looked down and quietly said, "You changed the locks." "Yes," I answered. He nodded once, almost to himself. I guess I deserved that. I stepped aside just enough to let him in. He hesitated before walking through the doorway, glancing once more at the new lock before following me into the kitchen. We sat across from each other at the table, the same table where I'd helped him with homework, celebrated birthdays, and watched him grow into the man sitting in front of me now. Neither of us reached for the coffee between us. The steam slowly disappeared until both cups had gone cold. My son wrapped both hands around his mug without taking a sip. After a long silence, he reached into his pocket and placed the old house key on the table. It landed between us with a soft, metallic click. Neither of us touched it. I simply looked at it while slowly running one finger around the rim of my coffee cup. The silence stretched long enough that it almost became its own conversation. Finally, he whispered, "Mom, I didn't think it had gotten this far." I looked at him quietly. "How far did you think it had gotten?" He stared at the key for several seconds before answering. "I honestly don't know anymore." He let out a slow breath. "It didn't happen all at once. At first it was little things. A birthday dinner, a barbecue, my father-in-law asking if everyone could meet there because there was more space. Every single time. I told myself we'd ask you later. Then one day, we stopped asking. I don't even remember when that happened." I believed him, not because it excused what he'd done, but because it sounded like the kind of mistake people make one small step at a time. He looked toward the living room where his father's photograph still sat on the bookshelf. "Dad always told me if something wasn't yours, you asked before touching it." His voice cracked. I spent my whole life hearing him say that, and somehow I became the kind of man who forgot. Neither of us spoke for several moments. The only sound in the room was the ticking clock on the kitchen wall. Then I slowly slid the old key back across the table toward him. "Keep it," I said quietly. He looked at me, confused. "It doesn't open anything anymore." He stared at the key resting in his palm, and for the first time since he'd arrived, tears rolled freely down his face. I wasn't talking about the lock. He knew that. After a while, he finally asked, "Are you going to sell the house?" "No," I answered. Relief briefly crossed his face before disappearing again. "But things can't go back to the way they were." He nodded slowly. This time, he didn't try to defend himself. He didn't make promises. He simply stood, walked towards the front door, and paused with his hand on the knob. For a moment, he looked down at the old key still resting in his hand before quietly slipping it back into his pocket. Not because it could still open my door, but because it reminded him of the trust he'd lost. I watched him leave without saying another word. As the door closed behind him, I realized something I hadn't understood before. Changing the locks had protected my house. Whether my family would ever earn their way back inside was a different question entirely. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. My son called every few days, but our conversations stayed short. He never asked about the house again. He never mentioned the locks. Instead, he asked how I was sleeping, whether I'd been eating well, and if I needed anything from the grocery store. They were ordinary questions, but after everything that had happened, I noticed something different. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't assuming anything. He was asking. A week later, he came by carrying a small envelope. He waited on the porch until I opened the door. Then, without stepping inside, he handed it to me. Inside were 3 spare keys. "Mine," he said quietly. "My wife's, and the one her parents had." I looked up at him. "Are you sure these are all of them?" He nodded. "As far as I know." Then he paused before adding, "If there are any others, they won't matter anymore." I believed him, not because trust had been fully repaired, but because, for the first time, He wasn't asking me to believe his promises. He was changing his actions. A few days later, my daughter-in-law asked if she could come see me alone. I almost said no, but something told me that if I wanted honesty from others, I had to be willing to listen when it finally arrived. She stood nervously in my living room, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. For a long time, she couldn't seem to find the right words. Finally, she whispered, "The day my mother asked me for the key." I handed it to her without even thinking about calling you. She looked down at the floor. I didn't even stop to ask myself if I had the right. Tears filled her eyes. I've replayed that moment every day since you left the house. If I'd stopped for just 30 seconds, none of this would have happened. I let the silence settle between us before quietly asking, "Do you know what hurt me the most?" She slowly shook her head. It wasn't the party. It wasn't even the keys. She looked at me, waiting. It was realizing that everyone else had started making decisions about my house before anyone thought to ask me. She closed her eyes for a moment and nodded. This time, she didn't defend herself. She didn't explain. She simply accepted the weight of those words. About a month later, I rented the house to a young couple expecting their first baby. The afternoon they signed the lease, they stood in the empty living room, thanking me over and over for trusting them with the home. As they were leaving, the young husband stopped at the front door and smiled. "We'll take good care of it," he said. I smiled back. "I know you will." Watching them leave, I realized the difference wasn't that they were strangers. It was that they understood something my own family had forgotten for a while. Respect always comes before permission feels unnecessary. Over the months that followed, my relationship with my son slowly began to heal, not through one apology, but through dozens of small choices. He asked before making plans. He waited for answers instead of assuming them. Little by little, respect returned to places where entitlement had quietly taken its place. Some wounds heal with time. Others heal because people finally choose to become different than they were before. As for the old key, my son once told me, he'd still kept it in the drawer beside his bed. Not because it could ever unlock my house again, but because every time he saw it, he remembered something he never wanted to forget. A house is never yours simply because you have the key. It's yours only when you've earned the trust to be invited inside.